At the end of today, you guys are going to be able to talk to each other about the theories of classical and operant conditioning, and you'll probably explore different learning styles. It'll end up just being part of your conversations today. So you guys are getting a little bit of a throwback presentation here, which I am wicked stoked about. Not really, but you'll enjoy it. No, you won't. Maybe you will. This is a Prezi. I used to use Prezis all the time. Love, love, love them. And this is by far one of my favorite presentations. And hold on a second. The crappy thing about Prezis is that it doesn't let us go through and start where I want to start. So I'm going to introduce you to learning, right? Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or mental process resulting from experience. It's relatively permanent, right? Because if we think about sensory memory and what it takes to move things from sensory to short term, you have to pay attention, okay? You have to pay attention to that. And then being somewhat intentional. One of the students in the exit tickets had mentioned, is there any way to get things into long-term memory really efficiently outside of trauma? And they brought up a brilliant point in that when we talk about trauma and we talk about trauma cues, what we're talking about are those tethers, right? Those little strings. And for trauma, they end up being this very complex web, and they're very sensitive triggers, right? They're very sensitive webs. And so something that kind of might look like something could also bring up all of that other stuff. And the individual in the exit ticket made a brilliant point in that we learn so quickly because in that moment, because our body, our brain, which is designed to save our lives at all times, is trying to encode as much information as possible to ensure our survival. And so what it does is it takes all of that information, it assigns it a massive value and allows us to recall it very, very quickly. And one of the best ways to do this, and I mentioned this when we were talking about memory, one of the best ways to do this just on our own, outside of, you know, facilitating a traumatic event for ourselves, which is nothing that we want to do, is taking the time to make a personal connection, right? It doesn't have to be about saving our lives. It could be about increasing our quality of life. It could be about understanding parts of our life. There are many different ways, but the best bang for the buck is to take it personally and make it personal. So when you guys move into your study groups and you start talking about this class and the work that you're doing, the more connections you make to your own experience, the more effective you're going to be at pulling that information out in long-term memory. So it's relatively permanent because of all the things that it takes to get into long-term memory. It's also relatively permanent because, again, sometimes what was a peninsula and we had access to becomes an island, and we lose that access because we don't practice things as much. I know that every year, and I tell this story every semester, but every year getting on my snowboard for the first time, getting off the chairlift the first day, guaranteed I'm going to fail at least once, guaranteed. And so I have to relearn that, right? But as soon as I get it so much more quickly. It's that muscle memory that really ends up empowering me and allows me to be really effective at that. All learning is basically associative learning, which means that we are making connections. Okay, we are making connections and we're building this complicated web of associations for our entire life. And so when I say make those connections with something to you personally, the more deeper you're able to connect that content to something that is central to who you are, how you feel, or what you believe, the more effective you're going to be at being able to pull that information out of long-term memory. Now, we have lots of different dudes, founding fellows that we could talk about here. We're going to talk about Pavlov first. Pavlov and John Watson are our primary researchers in this area of classical conditioning. Now, John Watson gets the majority of the press because he was living in an unoccupied communist country at the time, and John Watson was able to publish. Ian Pavlov was not. He was in an occupied communist country and was not allowed to share his research outside of his small group. A lot of you know the story of Pavlov. He was an endocrinologist. He was studying digestion. He was trying to understand how salivation informed digestive juices and if there was some degree of efficiency and what would happen if you changed things. So what he did is he surgically inserted tubes into the salivary glands of dogs. No, they weren't the Dalmatians that you see here. But they were surgically placed in the salivary glands, and then they would expose the dogs to different food types at different times, and they would measure how much saliva would collect. Well, as things happen, the research study got screwed up because all of a sudden the dogs were salivating and there wasn't even any food out there. And so Pavlov, being the great scientist that he was, started to do the first thing you have to do in all scientific investigations, and he just started to observe. He started to watch, and then he noticed that the dogs would start to salivate when specific research assistants would come in. And eventually he made the connection that those were the research assistants that fed the dogs, even though it wasn't feeding time. My dog is like, feeding time? Even though it wasn't time, right, for any of that, the dogs still had made this learned association with those specific individuals. So then, of course, Pavlov had to, he wanted to be able to do his endocrinological experiments. So he's like, how am I going to work around this? So he started to play with things a little bit, just out of curiosity. I do wonder if he resents that he's most famous for this than maybe his physiological work. But what he saw, right, is that there's this naturally occurring conditioning. If you look across the top sort of green shaded bar, the set of boxes over to the left, we have the unconditioned stimulus, which is the UCS. And then we have the unconditioned response, which is the UCR. Now, it's really important that those U's are there, and you'll see that especially as we get down to the bottom second row all the way over to the right. But this is a naturally occurring. Now, anytime I'm talking about learning in class, basically learning is this spiral. It's always happening. And so what I'm asking you to do is, for purposes of explanation, is we just stop the learning process, almost like taking a snippet of that communication, right? So we're in a song and we're just going to pull out a set of beats. So we pull out those beats and we say, okay, this starts here. This unconditioned stimulus is the food. It's something that a dog would salivate to anyway. Well, you're right. Not every dog would salivate to every food. They would have to learn to salivate to that. So that's why I'm asking you to allow for example purposes and suspend your prior knowledge. So unconditioned food, unconditioned stimulus is the food, unconditioned response is salivation. And then what he did is he checked to see if a bell was a neutral stimulus. And so what he did there is he played the bell and he looked for salivation, right? Because salivation was the response that he was curious about. And the precursor, the food and the bell, was what he wanted to understand and what he wanted to change things up to see if he could create that associative learning. So in the box, the orange shaded one labeled conditioning, we have the neutral stimulus, which was shown to be the bell, and we add that to the pre-existing relationship of the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. Now, traumatic association happens with just one pairing, okay? Just one singular, significant, life-altering, threatening event changes it instantaneously. Some people require that repeated pairing over time. And sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it takes shorter, just depends on how significant it is. After a period of time where we're working on the conditioning, we end up having this post-conditioning association, which is the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, and the conditioned response. Now, when you see information on the exam, remember for yourself, what was once neutral becomes conditioned, okay? What was once neutral becomes conditioned. And that is how we understand classical conditioning. Now, I'm not entirely sure why they call it classical. I don't, maybe they think that that's the origin point of conditioning itself, but that's why they call it classical. Every time someone flushes a toilet in the apartment building, the shower becomes very hot and causes the person to jump back. Over time, the person begins to jump back automatically after hearing the flush. Who wouldn't, right? Who wouldn't jump back? So I am going to open my chat and I would like to see, I would like conditioned stimulus. You're saying conditioned stimulus, but we haven't yet phrased the question. Identify, if you would, the unconditioned stimulus? What is the pre-existing stimulus that is present in this scenario? Okay, Brian wins, right? It's actually the hot water. So when you think about this dog salivating to the food, that relationship already exists, right? If you have hot water on you, you are going to jump back, right? That naturally exists. So if hot water is the unconditioned stimulus, what is the unconditioned response? Jumping back. Absolutely. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So if that is the unconditioned response, okay, what is our neutral stimulus? Flushing the toilet, right? Making that association. So now I'm really wary because I don't want to get burned. And now I know that when I hear that toilet flush, something hot is coming. So we now have our neutral stimulus. What is the conditioned stimulus in our example? In thinking about that learning relationship, yes, it's the same thing as the neutral, because what was once neutral becomes conditioned. And then our subsequent conditioned response is what? The jumping back. Good job. Thank you to everybody who engaged in the little chat. Now, this is one of my favorites, right? This idea. This scenario is actually what we call the Garcia effect. This was named after a researcher, and what he found is he was actually working on, long story short, he got hooked on taste aversion, where these mice would stop drinking from the water that had the medicines. This happened to me and I cannot eat hot dogs anymore. Brian, I'm sorry. This happened to me and I can't eat chicken masala anymore. But this is taste aversion. This is taste aversion. And what happens is we learn an association, and there is no more powerful, poor mac and cheese, there is no more powerful lesson that our body wants to learn, and that is to make sure and not ingest poisons. So even if you had the flu, right, or you were, let's say you had an allergic response that made you vomit, no matter what, if you vomit, it's whatever that taste is going to be the one that you stay away from. And so I just kind of wanted to point out a rainbow in this research. And the rainbow in this research is that we actually use this science today to help people who are going through chemotherapy. One of the biggest issues in treating people with cancer and chemotherapy is the nausea that comes after the treatment. And a lot of people started to become food adverse because they would throw up everything and they just didn't want to eat anything because they didn't want to become sick. And what they did is they created some lollipops that actually have a chemical composition. They're scent free, right? Taste is like savoring and things like that is, I think, 70 to 75% smell. So you take a sucker that has absolutely no smell to it whatsoever, but the chemical composition on your tongue is so entirely unique that it doesn't look like anything that we eat in our culture, not just in our culture, but that we eat in general. So you're going to avoid building those taste aversions. So that is a lot of times what they suck on while they're getting treatment in order to do that. Oh, your grandma only liked milkshakes. Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating and sad. And this is also a non-old white dude, and I get excited about talking about that. I think it's important of note because we don't have a lot of reference points, right? We're talking about Pavlov, a European white dude, and Watson's. These are the principles that Watson used. On our last example, an individual receives frequent injections of drugs, which are administered in a small examination room at a clinic. The drug itself causes an increased heart rate. After several trips to the clinic, simply being in a small room causes an increased heart rate. So I want to reverse engineer this a little bit. Now, imagine that you only have this last bit of information, right? Let's tease apart the last part of that final sentence. What is the small room? What is the small room in our classical conditioning example? Is it the neutral stimulus? Is it the conditioned stimulus? Yes, it's the neutral stimulus. Awesome. And what are we going to be able to say about that heart rate change, that increased in heart rate? Is that a conditioned response, an unconditioned response, or an unconditioned stimulus, or a conditioned stimulus? Good. You guys have some confusion in the chat, and you should, because it is both the conditioned response and the unconditioned response. Okay, that is brilliant. Good catch, you guys. Good catch. And then our pre-existing relationship is between the drugs and the heart rate increase. I was fortunate enough to get to work one-on-one with a student that only had, didn't have anybody else in their breakout groups. So I went and joined them. And one of the things that I want to point out is that when you see a question like this on the exam, which you will, you're going to want to focus just on the language that you're given, right? Don't extrapolate anything from it. Make sure and use the language that you're given. That will definitely help. Yes, the unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response, but only after conditioning. Yes, they're caused by different stimuli. Good job, folks. All right, now I want to talk to you about this founding fellow. This founding fellow is one of my favorite flavors, B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner was a behavior purist, okay? He's also sort of the founding individual for operant conditioning. He believed, he was a student of Thorndike, and Thorndike was this philosophical psychologist that really believed that for every cause there was an effect, right? You might not see it, but for every cause there was an effect. And that is the best use of our resources, is focusing on that. So B.F. Skinner devised this very curious device, which we call the Skinner box, in order to conduct animal research. Now I'm going to zoom in here on my little rat. You can see that there's a lever that the rat could press. There's a light, there's a speaker on one side. And so what it worked to do, and then just down below along that sort of left side is where the pellet would be dispensed, the food. And what he did is he worked out a program, a system of reinforcement in order to get the rat to go to the bar, to press the bar in order to get the pellet. Now, he built a lot of complex behaviors. He worked with rats, pigeons, and cats, I believe. He might have had another species in there, but I don't remember. But he loved training them. And he used a principle called shaping, which is where you reward each successive approximation towards a desired behavior. So let's say you want to get your child to clean up their room. You go downstairs and their floor is clear, but everything, like their bed is piled with stuff, the bookcase is piled with stuff, and you give them a good job, right? They get a reward, something that's going to increase their behavior. And then the next time you come down, if they haven't done better than that, then they don't get a reward, right? But then they're like, oh, well, in order for me to get that reward, I've got to do extra. I've got to actually fold my laundry and put it away. Then they get the reward. You want to work towards having a tidy space. Yes, I am manipulative, and I have used that with my children. Thank you very much. Operant conditioning falls into two main sort of approaches, reinforcement and punishment. And I'm going to give you the punchline right now. Punishment does not work. Okay, there are very small subgroups of individuals for which punishment is actually effective, but for the most part, it actually works against you. And if we have time, which I have a feeling we're not going to, yeah, we won't have time, I would happily chat with you about why punishment doesn't work. One of them being, if you punish people, you instill fear rather than understanding, and fear will always trump learning, will always surmount, will always surpass, will always be given more weight in our brain than anything else. Fear will do that. So reinforcement increases a behavior. Now, I told you that that rat found that pellet reinforcing, right? That was added to the environment. So a positive reinforcement is when something is added to the environment. A negative reinforcement is when something is taken away. No matter what, in reinforcement, a behavior is increasing. So when you read a scenario, just ask yourself one of two questions first. One, is a behavior increasing or decreasing? And then ask yourself, was something added or was something removed? Okay, if it's positive, then something was added. That pellet dropping down would be something added to that rat's environment, like a good job for pressing on the bar. But, right, if Skinner was a twisted person, right, like John Watson, he would actually put negative things into the environment and then remove those, okay, things that hurt. So there could be a small electrical shock that goes into that rat's feet. But once that rat presses on the bar, the electrical shock goes away. That is still reinforcement because we're increasing the probability of the rat pressing on the lever, okay? But it's negative because something was removed. That shock was removed. That adverse stimulus was taken away. I see students trip over positive reinforcement and punishment more than anything else. So please, this lecture will be up on our Blackboard. Please review it. I think it's really, really important to do that. Punishment is when there is a decrease in behavior, right? When we decrease something happening, like instead my daughter gets her phone taken away because she doesn't keep her room clean. That would be a punishment, but that would be a negative punishment, again, because something was removed. A positive punishment would be something like capital punishment, like a spanking or maybe extra chores. Other types of negative punishments are, opportunities are removed. I know that when I was an undergrad in my freshman year and I ended up on academic probation because it was 13th grade for me, when you go on academic probation, your freedom to take what classes you want is removed. So that was a negative punishment. I definitely didn't want to be there again. Traditionally, when we think about positive punishment, we think about capital punishment, things like spankings and consequences like that. Now, speeding tickets, right, is something being added or removed. It depends on which number of speeding ticket it is. If it's your first one, then something's being added, right? A cost to your environment that sucks and you don't want to do that. But you could also have things removed if you've done them a few too many times. Trust me that when we give you these types of questions on the exams, it'll be really clear and we won't have that kind of gray area where there could be some misinterpretation.